The file is dated the 14th of February 1919. The war has been over for 94 days. The men are coming home or trying to. The field hospitals are still clearing. And here, in a memorandum from the Home Office to the Secretary of State, is a recommendation, measured, bureaucratic, entirely unremarkable in tone, that the interception of private correspondence should continue. Not against German agents, not against foreign saboteurs, against British trade union organizers, against the leaders of the dock strikes, against men whose only proven offense was organizing other men to stop working. The memo does not frame this as a continuation of wartime emergency powers. It frames it as a matter of domestic security. Nobody voted on this. No parliamentary debate was held. The machinery that Britain had built to fight one kind of war simply turned. This is not the story of a surveillance state that appeared fully formed in the 20th century. It is the story of how one was assembled, piece by piece, between 1909 and 1919, under the cover of genuine emergency, and how the emergency was allowed to expire while the apparatus was not. Her name does not appear in the official records. Almost none of them do. What we know is this. By the winter of 1916, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people were working inside Salisbury House and the Hotel Cecil on the Victoria Embankment, the requisitioned commercial buildings that housed the largest postal censorship operation in British history. The majority of them were women. They arrived in shifts. They worked at long tables under artificial light. They opened letters. The work was not romantic. It was not what the war posters showed: the nurse, the factory girl, the land worker. It was closer to what a sorting office might look like if every parcel was also evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet. Letters from soldiers, letters to neutral countries, business correspondence between London firms and contacts in Amsterdam, Zurich, Stockholm. Personal letters that had been flagged by algorithm, by which I mean flagged by a set of keywords, reviewed by a reader, copied, resealed, forwarded. The women who did this work were vetted by the War Office. They signed declarations. They were paid, though not equivalently to the men in supervisory roles above them. Several of them had degrees from Oxford or Cambridge women's colleges, at a time when those degrees were not formally recognized by either university. One of the unit's senior readers, according to a brief reference in a 1917 internal review, had previously worked as a translator for a literary publisher. Her name has not, to date, been recovered. They processed, at the operation's peak, an estimated 200,000 pieces of correspondence per day. The figure comes from a 1916 report by the Director of Military Intelligence, cited in subsequent histories of British censorship. The women who handled those letters are not in the report. Their last ordinary moment, as far as the record allows us to reconstruct it, was probably unremarkable. A morning shift, a desk, another bundle. The war grinding on somewhere across the channel, the mail still coming. To understand what was built, you have to go back to the year before the war. In August 1911, the Official Secrets Act passed through the House of Commons in 40 minutes. 40 minutes for a piece of legislation that would, over the following century, be used to prosecute journalists, gag civil servants, suppress inquiry after inquiry, and provide the legal architecture for almost every surveillance expansion that followed. The bill was introduced as a narrow, technical amendment to earlier spy legislation, a housekeeping measure, essentially. It was anything but. Under its provisions, the state gained the power to prosecute not merely the leaking of official information, but the receiving of it. The journalist who published a leak could now be prosecuted alongside the civil servant who made it. The public interest was not a defense. The procedural maneuvering that got it through so quickly, the suspension of normal reading stages, was later described by one Liberal MP, in a letter to a colleague, as the most significant thing passed in this session that nobody will remember passing. He was right about the significance. He was wrong about the memory, not because people remembered, but because they were prevented from examining it. 3 years later, the war began, and the apparatus that had been waiting for a legal framework now had a justification. Mo 5G, the section that would become MI5, had been operational since 1909, founded by Vernon Kell on the basis of a report that overstated, significantly, the size and sophistication of German espionage networks in Britain. Kell's founding document, now available at the National Archives, warned of a coordinated spy network with hundreds of operatives embedded in British ports, railways, and military installations. The evidence for this, when examined, consisted largely of unverified reports and the anxieties of a service that needed a threat to justify its existence. Germany did run intelligence operations in Britain. They were not the vast network Kell described. By the time war was declared, Kell had compiled a registry of alien residents, a network of postal intercepts authorized under the 1911 Act, and critically, a bureaucratic infrastructure that had been normalized before a single crisis had occurred. The war didn't create British surveillance. It gave British surveillance its alibi. Here is where the documented record starts to diverge from the story we inherited. The standard history of British intelligence in the Great War runs roughly like this. War emergency created exceptional measures. Exceptional measures were wound down after the armistice. The lessons learned were applied more carefully the next time around. It is a story of proportionate response and institutional self-correction. The documents tell a different story. In September 1919, 9 months after the armistice, Vernon Kell circulated an internal memorandum arguing for the continuation and expansion of MI5's domestic surveillance mandate. The targets he named were not residual German agents. They were not foreign provocateurs. They were the shop stewards movement, the Socialist Labor Party, and individuals connected to what Kell described as Bolshevist agitation in British trade unions. The memo explicitly cited the Russian Revolution as evidence that domestic political movements required monitoring. It did not cite any evidence that these movements posed a violent threat to the British state. It cited their politics. The memo was approved. This is a documented fact. It is in the National Archives. It is also almost entirely absent from popular histories of British intelligence, which tend to treat the period between 1919 and 1939 as a kind of institutional pause, a gap between the wars, rather than a 20-year expansion of peacetime surveillance conducted without parliamentary oversight, public knowledge, or meaningful legal constraint. The cable and wireless program adds another layer. Britain had, during the war, extended its interception capabilities to cover not merely postal correspondence but telegraphic and cable communications, rooted, in large part, through British-controlled cable infrastructure. This gave British intelligence something remarkable: effective access to diplomatic and commercial cables passing between neutral countries, including the United States. American diplomatic traffic was intercepted. The extent to which this was known to American counterparts was a source of serious tension after the war. A 1920 exchange of diplomatic communications, referenced in David Stafford's History of British Intelligence, indicates that elements of the American State Department were aware that British cable monitoring had extended to U.S. traffic, and were not satisfied with the explanations given. The interception didn't stop after the armistice either. It was transferred, renamed, redistributed between the newly consolidated intelligence directorates. The work described in the next section of this script took investigators, academic historians working primarily with declassified Home Office and War Office files, the better part of 3 decades to piece together. Most of it remains incompletely understood. If that's the kind of history this channel is covering, the slow archaeology of what was buried, and why subscribing means you'll be here for the next excavation. The most precise measure of what was built is not the volume of interceptions. It is the institutional permanence. By 1919, Britain had a domestic intelligence service with no statutory basis in law, operating under royal prerogative, a postal interception program that had been running since before the war and was redirected, not discontinued, after it, an Official Secrets Act that criminalized the reporting of its existence, a cable interception capability that had been used against Allied and neutral communications without authorization, and a Home Office framework that had normalized the sharing of intelligence between the security services and the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, an arrangement that would remain largely unchanged and largely unexamined for decades. None of this was voted on. Most of it was not known to Parliament. The Home Secretary received reports. The Cabinet received summaries. The committees that might have scrutinized it were either not informed or were themselves subject to the Official Secrets Act. The 1911 Act had done its work. What makes this more than bureaucratic history is the question of what the apparatus was for by 1919. The German threat, whatever its real dimensions, had ceased to exist. The justification that had been used to build the machine was gone. What remained was a machine pointed, with official approval, at British citizens engaged in legal political activity. The dock strikes of 1919, the police strikes, the triple alliance of miners, railwaymen, and transport workers. These were not armed insurrections. They were labor disputes, and they were monitored, surveilled, reported on, their leaders' correspondence intercepted by a domestic intelligence service that had been built for a different war and never stood down. We know this because the files, when they were eventually declassified, were still there. The memos, the agent reports, the intercepts, 40 years of material on trade union officials, socialist politicians, peace campaigners, and journalists, gathered under authority derived from emergency powers that the emergency had expired to justify. The historical question that deserves to sit with you is not whether Britain was right to build the surveillance apparatus it built in 1914. Emergency measures under genuine wartime conditions are at least arguable. The question is who made the decision, and when, and for what purpose, to turn the machine around and point it at home. The February 1919 memo is part of that answer. It is not the whole answer. We do not even now have a complete picture of the decisions made in the months after the armistice about which surveillance programs would continue, under whose authority, targeting whom. Some files remain closed. Some were destroyed. Some, the standard fate of inconvenient bureaucratic history, were simply never formally recorded. Vernon Kell ran MI5 until 1940, when Churchill sacked him following the embarrassment of how many enemy agents had been successfully operating in Britain at the start of the Second World War, the precise vulnerability his service had been created to prevent. He had been in post for 31 years. The domestic surveillance infrastructure he had built and argued to preserve in 1919 outlasted him. The Hotel Cecil was demolished in 1930 and replaced with a Shellmex building. The women who worked there are not commemorated. Their contribution to the intelligence history of the First World War does not appear in the standard accounts of Bletchley Park, GCHQ, or the development of British signals intelligence, though the postal and cable censorship operations they ran were, in a direct institutional line, the forerunners of all of it. The 1911 Official Secrets Act remained substantially in force until 1989, when it was replaced by a new act that, among other things, explicitly removed the public interest defense that the old act had never formally granted, but that defendants had occasionally attempted to invoke. Journalists who reported on the workings of the intelligence services could still be prosecuted under the new legislation. The Housekeeping Amendment of 1911 had, in this sense, been updated and renewed. The Investigatory Powers Act of 2016, the so-called Snoopers Charter, placed on a statutory footing, for the first time, bulk data collection and interception powers that British intelligence had been exercising in various forms and with varying degrees of legal ambiguity, since 1914. It took over a century to write them into law. They had never really stopped. Somewhere in Salisbury House in the winter of 1916, a woman whose name we cannot recover is opening someone else's mail. She has been doing this for 2 years. She is good at it. She can read French, German, and Dutch. She knows what a forged postmark looks like. She knows the difference between a letter written under duress and a letter written in fear of a different kind. She knows, in other words, more than almost anyone in Britain about what the war actually looks like from the inside of a private life. The official history of Britain's surveillance apparatus begins with threat assessment, legal frameworks, and the names of the men who ran the services that built it. It doesn't begin with her. That gap between the people who built the thing and the story of why the thing was built is not an accident of the archive. It is the archive doing what archives have always done, preserving the account that the people in power wanted preserved. The machine they built is still running. The question is whether it ever really had an off switch, or whether the off switch was always just for show.